coming out today, especially those of you in the back. I'm so sorry that you don't have chairs, but thank y'all especially for being here today. I really wanted to give my thanks to Kike Roach and Andrew Crew for inviting me to deliver this keynote today. It's an honor, and also I really just want to give love for all the amazing work that you have done for this community here. So really, thanks again for Kike. I also want to say thanks to Pascal for the work, lots of behind-the-scene work that you did to make this happen, to Cyrus and Giosla, to Amakudai Les Boys, to Hawa Meyer, to Denise O'Neill Green, also for being part of this event. It's so lovely to really have something like this that we're also, doing as a community event, that we're building community at the same time as we're just speaking to these issues. Maybe I'll speak a little bit further away, and we'll hope for the best. I also want to thank A Different Book List for being here to sell books. The Different Book List is a everyone should buy their books there instead of Amazon if we're going to be speaking about 21st century Black liberation, which is the title of my talk. So, particularly given the theme of the power we have, I think there is a lot of power in this room, and I think that that's something that that we all really need to come back to in the light of the recent election, the shit show of the past 2 years, the past 10 years, the past 500 years. Focusing on the power we have is a life-giving and a life-saving necessity for all of us. So before jumping into what I mean by 21st century Black liberation, I'd like to speak to the present moment. We often hear the statement, make racists afraid again. And I think this is a very important goal. The goal to make racism intolerable, to make it abhorrent, to make it embarrassing. In short, to strip away its appeal and its promises, to expose it for the ugliness that it is. For there to be consequences for racist acts and behaviors, I think, is something that we're all aiming to return to. You cannot not mention Donald Trump if you're talking about the present, thinking to the most powerful man in the world being a repeat sexual offender who has locked thousands of children in cells across the United States with still significant popular support. It speaks to a particular moment that we are in. But well beyond the United States, where so much focus is so frequently leveled, especially in this country, I think that we can acknowledge that in this city, in this province, in this country, the euphemisms are largely gone, and racists can often express openly, or with very thin reference, political aspirations for those who support, for example, a white ethno-state, which is going to be debated. Somebody supporting that will be debating soon at the University of Toronto, where now up for debate is the non-existence, the brutal denial of trans and gender non-conforming people. Somebody won third place for mayor who has openly referenced the so-called Jewish question and actively supported Nazis. This is something that we need to recognize as very real, as a very real part of our moment. I'm also thinking about the election. We often, I've only lived in Toronto for a few months, but I've already noticed the tendency to not look at what's happening in the other province, but it's very significant that in Quebec, the CAQ, the Coalition Avenir de Québec, was recently elected, partially campaigning on reducing immigration quotas and bringing in integration testing for migrants who could therefore not become citizens if they do not pass the test. From the so-called center to the right, we have John Tory referring to Black people as sewer rats, a city councillor referring to Black people as cockroaches. So we need to realize that people are not playing and they're not hiding anymore. I think the best way to really frame it, if you want to encompass what's happening right now, is a white lash, in which many have taken off their hoods, but all have not. From Charlottesville to the Proud Boys to elected officials. It's no longer politically unacceptable, if it ever really was, for white people to suggest that they are being overrun, that there's a threat to traditional values and traditional demographics. But what we really know is that this is a barely veiled reference to our very presence here. So it does appear in some ways that racists are no longer at this moment fear reprimand, fear consequence, and that our humanity as Black people, queer people, disabled people, etc. is up for debate. Now I think that it's important to remember that the crisis being perceived by those who are part of this white lash at this moment is not only because of our presence. Although there are more of us here than there have been historically, we know that Black people on this continent were very desirable when we were property. Right? It's a crisis of a perceived threat of racial leveling, of Black and Indigenous and Arab and Muslim people and what we have demanding in terms of justice in a so-called free society. Although we know that it's not a threat to white people, but a looming threat that we pose to the end of a 500-year period of unearned and violently enforced white dominance, that what's occurring now we need to understand as a response to the successes of the last few generations of social movement, of decolonization, of the red and black power movements. We're seeing a response to the successes of our ancestors and of those of us who are still fighting today. In some sense, what is becoming clear is that powerful factions in our society are finally admitting publicly, admitting freely, that freedom and equality of countries like Canada and the United States was never intended to be for those who are not racialized white, for those who do not neatly fit into the gender divide. What is happening around us with the global rise of white nationalist movements, including in Brazil more broadly, should be alarming. But I think if we really want to ground ourselves in the present conditions, if we want to engage in future-driven political work, it's necessary that we actually have an analysis of both our history and our present that I think will move us away from a sort of Trump amnesia that makes us think that suddenly there's racism and that it's terrible and that we must act, but erases so much of what has come before. Globally, the right-leaning, the white-leaning shift is alarming, but it's not new. It follows the political logics of a crisis that's 500 years in the making. And I'm speaking about the twin apocalypses at the heart of what we now call the Americas. The kidnapping of 15 million Africans, of 2 million dead at the bottom of the ocean, the genocide of indigenous habitants, and this ongoing structure of settler colonialism. I'm speaking of the indentured labor of Chinese workers, the internment of Japanese Canadians. In short, I'm speaking to 5 centuries of entrenched white supremacist practices that have cemented a global order, hierarchized by race and gender, based on the pillage of resources of Africa, Caribbean, and South and Central America. Despite having effected important successes in the generations, we're living in a present that is very much inhabited by the past. If this level of racist and sexist and misogynist speech acts are new, if this level of acceptability is new, in North America and Europe, the nature of the global economy, the nature of the structures of our society have been fundamentally structured around racism long before the return of these acceptable acts. Further, a lot of what's happening here now is not unfamiliar to other parts of the world. The economic crises, the privatization and debt, the unaffordability, the unfunding of public services that we're seeing today in Canada and the United States has been part of an international policy that has been enacted on Black and brown populations since they dared decolonize the places that they lived. Through structural adjustments programs, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, we've seen this before. It has just not been done in the countries that are historically where the inheritors of the stolen wealth reside. Now I'm saying all of this not to make us depressed, because I think one can. I'm not saying you can't be depressed. You can be if you so choose. Anyways, you know what I'm saying. Sorry. But what I'm getting at is that what I'm really trying to do, though, is to ground us in our historical context, to say that, yes, we have to fight, but we've also been fighting for a long, long time. And we have to push back against the newly emboldened front of white supremacist activities. And we should not minimize the existential threat that this does pose to our collective safety, but we need to remember that when we are fighting back, we are fighting not just to go back to Obama, which, let me remind you, was the president when the Black Lives Matter movement was born. We're fighting not to go back to the pretense of tolerating people of multiple races and ethnic backgrounds and genders while still having people while Black people are still being gunned down on the streets by police. This is not the back of 2 years ago. This is not the back of pre-Trump or the pre-Ford that we want to go back to. We're actually fighting and have been fighting for generations for something new, for something different. And that's what I really wanted to ground us in today, although I'm going to be speaking about many kinds of state violence that I do believe we need to understand to fight for the future that we want. I think we need to remember exactly that, this long-standing structural world that we must refuse, and that we must actually build something entirely new, that we need to break from these long-standing trajectories.